committee, and I have to tell you that the program committee had a lot of fun putting this panel together. You know, what were the headlines going to be when we came around to this point in time? And the headlines are huge. Huge. Okay, right. Bigly. Okay, I just want to say a few things. One is that this piece over here that you see was created during a performance on Monday night by one of our artists who was here visiting up from New Orleans, and it's for sale for about 4 more hours. And then we're going to take it down, and she's going to take it back to New Orleans. So if anybody wants to buy it, part of it goes to the CWA, and it's expensive. So it'll be a big donation and a big purchase, and it's a big work. It's 11 by 11. Anyway, enough of that. I want to also say that CWA is free and open to the public, and we want to keep it that way. And so I'm just making a short pitch here for those of you who love CWA as I do, that you contribute. And there are a couple of ways to do that. On your smartphone, you can go to the app, and there's a donate button. You could also go to our website, and apparently there's a very prominent donate button. Or you could take envelopes at the back of the room and pick up one of those and donate in the traditional way. So I hope you enjoy this panel on Ripped from the Headlines. Have fun.
Thanks so much. Good morning. In this CWA session, we'll utilize both the CWA app and a notepad system, note card system, to receive any questions from the audience. To ask a question, simply go to the app and tap Live Q&A and then insert your question. You can also raise your hand at any time to request a note card and a pencil from one of the producers, and they'll take care of getting that to us up here. First of all, I'd like to ask everyone to please silence your cell phones. Thank you. My name is Al Manzi. I'm the publisher for the Daily Camera here in Boulder and president and CEO of Prairie Mountain Media. It's 19 newspapers and digital sites in the state. Today is April 14th, Friday, panel number 5312. It's entitled Ripped from the Headlines. Joining me today is our distinguished panel. We have Joe Sexton. Just raise your hand. He's a senior editor at ProPublica. Just won a Pulitzer Prize. I think they're 4th, producing investigative journalism in the public interest, nonprofit. Joe has served in reporting and editor roles for the New York Times for 25 years. We have Neil Diamant. He's a professor of law and Asian study at Dickinson College, teaching courses in Israeli politics and Zionism. He's also an accomplished author and noted writer. We have Stephen Hayward to my left. He's a senior resident scholar at the Institute of Governmental Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. He writes regularly for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and other publications. We have Daruna Jager. She's executive director of Breast Cancer Action, working to achieve health justice for all women who are at risk of and living with breast cancer. She's a leading voice, writer, and resource challenging the status quo in the breast cancer industry. We have Bill Marmon. He's managing editor of the online journal of the European Institute. He served for 11 years as a staff correspondent and bureau chief at Time Magazine all around the world. We have Dan Delary. He's president of the Wedgmere Group. He is a recognized opinion leader in energy and environmental arena. He has created cutting-edge ideas, policy, and practices to modernize the electricity system. Opening statements will be about 5 minutes, and then we'll have 20 to 25 minutes for discussion, and then the rest of the time for questions. So to get us started this morning, I'd like to ask Stephen Hayward to get us started.
Okay, well, thank you, Al. So, what's in the news? Well, 3 things for an opening bid. First of all, shouldn't someone say something nice about United Airlines? I mean, in these polarized times, I mean, what a great name for the one organization that's managed to unite all of America, right? You know, as Sean Spicer might put it, not even Hitler took people off airplanes after they boarded. Oh, it worked. I'm going to send that one in to somebody. Now, I do think that an awful lot of the conversation is going to be about the wrong thing. A lot of people are going to talk about, it's already in the news, that we need different and better regulation of overbooking and so forth. And I can go through the wonkery of that, but I don't want to waste time. We can come back to that in questions if you want. I think there's another part of the story that's not getting the right attention that I hope will get more, which is, and I'm still not clear on exactly what the mix of law enforcement was who came on that plane. But my first question is, why didn't any one of those, as any sentient being would, say to the United staff, you want us to do what? Yeah. And that opens a larger problem. So I'm a critic of the police these days from the right. And I mean, I think a lot of our law enforcement, most of them, the overwhelming majority, are terrific people who do a great job. But we've seen too many instances, a lot of them with the racial angle, of course, but I just saw a video last week of a cop with a white motorist, so it doesn't have the racial angle, is pulled over, and the guy hits him on the back of the head because he wasn't getting on his knees fast enough. What was his infraction? Driving too slow in the right-hand lane with his blinkers on because he's having a car problem. And, you know, the cop beats on him, and the court case in this case says he does not enjoy qualified immunity, so he's going to get sued. Good. I would rather that, I would hope this might be a tipping point in our conversation about what I think is the bureaucratization of the police. Something most people don't think about is, you know, our police have wider discretion to use lethal force than our soldiers in battle do, who have very strict rules of engagement. This is a problem, and you know, people have thoughts about that. Second item, of course, is yesterday's Trumpian bombing of Afghanistan. I mean, what it's called the mother of all bombs. Is there anything more Trumpian than that? Right? It's the biggest. It's the best. Right? And here, you know, I know from having written a lot of histories of, you know, doing research, historical research on, you know, military engagements, foreign policy things, that oftentimes you do not know what's going on behind the scenes. And so, for example, the last few years, I've been withholding judgment about what was going on with President Obama's Iran policy, because who knows what's really going on in the background. You know, years later, when you get the documents, when you talk to the people who were there, you learn often a very different story. And that may be the case here, but you know, you hear things about who is this really a message for? This is really a message for North Korea. We have a aircraft carrier task force steaming there, shore leave in Australia canceled. A story that I don't know if is true about China has massed 150,000 troops on the border above North Korea. Looks kind of scary. Could be. We'll see. What's the third story? Yes, turmoil in the Trump administration. So. Gee, this is news? I mean, I think we call that Monday, right? So the story you hear, so the fear of conservatives, or one of the fears of conservatives all along about Trump is that the guy doesn't have a real settled core. He's been a liberal Democrat most of his life. He's been on all sides of all issues. And this is more a matter of personal ambition. You couldn't rely on him. So notwithstanding the fact that he assembled a cabinet that would do Calvin Coolidge proud, to the right of Ronald Reagan's first cabinet for certain, this rumbling right now that maybe Steve Bannon is on his way out, and I do hear some inside things from people I know there. I'm blacklisted in the Trump White House, by the way, because I was one of the 22 conservatives on the Against Trump issue of National Review, but they call me and tell me stuff. And so, you know, the ascendant figure in the Trump White House is Gary Cohn, who's the chief economic guy, who's a Democrat, former president of Goldman Sachs, who, unknown to most people, was angling to be in that job for President Hillary Clinton. Isn't this interesting? And so the fear all along is that Trump would become Arnold Schwarzenegger. You know, he would move to the left, or who knows, he'd be entirely unpredictable. And so we may be seeing the early rumblings of that. And so those are my opening thoughts on what's in the news.
Neil?
Well, that's a hard act to follow. I think you missed your career. Is this working? Can you hear me in the back? Okay, well, I want to pick up on one of the previous points. The piece that I ripped from the headlines, I mean, I don't get a physical newspaper, at least here, so picture ripping it from my phone. China warns of storm clouds over Korean peninsula. And there was another headline this week, basically about President Donald Trump expecting China to intervene on our behalf with North Korea. And in return for this intervention, we would give China a better trade deal. And so the question that's brought to my mind was, does China in fact have a lot of leverage with regard to North Korea? And you would think that in some ways, yes, they would have. North Korea is very dependent on the United States for food, for trade, source of foreign currency. And so you might deduce from that, of course, they could threaten to withhold food, they can threaten to limit trade, they can limit the import of raw materials, and there you have it. You have leverage. China has leverage it can use. But I think before we conclude that, we have to look, first of all, at China's core interests. What are China's core interests in North Korea? And then ask if those interests are aligned with our interests. So what are China's core interests? I would say, first and foremost, to prevent the political collapse of North Korea. North Korea is an allied regime. They're both Leninists. They both have their origins in Marxism and Leninism. China did assist Korea during the Korean War, obviously, in the early 1950s. There's a long history between these two parties, and we can't just ignore that this history exists. There is an affinity between these two regimes. So that's the first interest. The second interest is to prevent the economic collapse of North Korea. The fear in China is that an economic collapse would produce a wave of refugees on its border. Picture a scenario of 1 million people gathering at the border, the Yalu River, demanding or starting to swim over. What sort of problems that would present, particularly in the age of social media, people drowning in the river, all sorts of terrible things could result from that. So China wants to prevent any sort of scenario that would produce a wave of refugees on its border. What could result from that is a slow, gradual takeover of by South Korea of North Korea. That is, a political and economic collapse of North Korea would result in South Korea effectively gaining control over the entire peninsula. South Korea is an American ally. So from the Chinese perspective, the collapse of North Korea would lead to the expansion of South Korean influence, and as a result of that, the United States would be right on its border. And this is something that it absolutely does not want. I would say the fourth interest is to prevent nuclearization of the Korean peninsula. So for China, the nuclear issue is not number 1, 2, or 3, but probably last on its list of priorities for the peninsula. Now, our problem is that for us, this is the number 1 issue. We have less of an issue with North Korea collapsing politically. We have less of an issue with South Korea gradually taking over North Korea, just like West Germany and East Germany, subsidizing, rebuilding their economy. This is all okay with us. We'd probably help them do it. However, for China, this is the ultimate nightmare scenario. And so we're really kind of speaking at cross purposes here. We want China to intervene on our behalf, but from the Chinese perspective, the status quo is still okay, so long as a North Korean regime exists, so long as there's not mass starvation, so long as the human rights violation doesn't cause a mass uprising. They are okay with a slow burn problem in North Korea, so long as the alternative scenarios don't take place. Now, Trump offers a better deal in terms of trade, but from the Chinese perspective, the deal that they currently have isn't so bad. They get to trade with us. A lot of people are making money thanks to foreign trade and investment. So from their perspective, what could possibly be so much better that would cause them to intervene on our behalf? So we might think that, yes, China can intervene and should intervene, but from the Chinese perspective, if you look at it kind of through their eyes, there's less of an interest and less of a need to, actually. so long as things don't really blow up. Now, none of this should suggest that North Korea is popular in China. In fact, I would say that overall North Korea is ridiculed and despised and disrespected among Chinese leaders and among the Chinese population. After all, one of the most fundamental things that leadership in China and elsewhere in Asia, one of the most fundamental tasks of leadership was to feed the people. This was from very old, from Confucian times, way back. And in this respect, the North Korean regime has failed miserably. And so while China has leapt ahead in leaps and bounds in terms of improving the quality of life of its citizens, North Korea has not. And so there's very little respect for the North Korean regime. As far as most people are concerned in China, the North Koreans are moochers. They don't reciprocate when they're given things like food. They disrespect China by going their own path. However, North Korea knows that China will not give up on them because of its core interest. And so they feel free to play brinkmanship. They feel free to be provocative so long as they don't step over a certain line. And what you see here is kind of a brinkmanship. North Korea trying to extract concessions from all parties in return for stopping further destabilization. That's the only card they have, being provocative and then withdrawing from provocation. And this is exactly what's going on now. So that's my take on the headline.
Well, good morning. It's great to be here, and I see a lot of familiar faces on Friday. This is my 9th panel of the week, so forgive me if I have not had a lot of opportunities to read the headlines. I thought I was going to catch up over the weekend on my flight home. And I run a breast cancer watchdog organization. So one of the first things is, in that line of work is never trust the headlines, right? If you trust the headlines, when it comes to any medical press release, you basically been told, the cure, we're on the brink of a cure, we're right there, things are happening, and you really do need to dig into the substance and the details of the study to find out what's really going on. And many times you find out, actually, you cured, a few thousand mice from cancer, but it's a long way to go before it actually makes a difference in real people's lives. And, because my topic is health, we see, all this excitement about precision medicine and the cancer moonshot. And when it comes to breast cancer, the reality is that we have too little to show for the billions spent in the name of breast cancer. And 26 years ago, when my organization was formed, 45,000 women died of breast cancer each and every year. This year, 40,000 women will die of breast cancer. And you can see we just are not making the progress that we need to make. And so when you look, kind of taking a spin on Trump, and I'm just looking forward to the discussion. I know we're going to have, there's a lot of things we can talk about. And I just want to say that in my line of work, the truth is important. The truth is knowable. It's verifiable. And I think that, I arguably am on this panel because, I'm here to help organize and make change. And in our theory of change, we educate, so look beyond the headlines, organize, get together with a lot of people, and take action, hold the powerful accountable. The areas that we're working on right now in terms of national policy are EPA. We are all exposed to chemicals throughout the course of our lives, from fetal exposures, exposures to chemicals through daily, consumer products, workplace exposures that are increasing the risk of cancer and other diseases and disorders. We need a strong EPA to protect public health, and we will be paying the price for a rollback for generations to come. This week, the headlines on healthcare and HHS, we know the Republicans and Trump have been pushing to repeal ACA for a long time, and that will have a devastating impact on women and on anyone with cancer, whether it's pre-existing conditions or just ability to access care. I guess this week, again, I'm barely reading the headlines. I hate to admit it, but I did read, and I do know that Trump is really playing politics with people's health by threatening to withhold payments for health insurance in the way that's going to harm the most vulnerable people, the people who most need health care. And I hope we have a chance to talk about that. And of course, I guess, he signed this executive order allowing states to defund Planned Parenthood. Again, people who most need access to health care. And so clearly, work there is important, and that's going to be going on for the foreseeable future. The last thing I want to note that isn't in the headlines is FDA. FDA has been largely overlooked in the, fire hose of horrible issues that we're trying to, counter. But FDA is incredibly important. FDA is there to ensure that drugs and devices used in medical treatments are safe and effective. We cannot allow companies to sell us hope and hype for hundreds of thousands of dollars, trusting that maybe we will benefit from them. Everything comes with harm as well as potential benefit, and we need to know that there is real benefit before we allow ourselves to experience the toxicity, whether it's financial toxicity or the health toxicity of treatments. So I'm going to make a real plug that I am deeply concerned about 21st century cures, which Obama signed into law. I think that Gottlieb, who's Trump's nominee for FDA, is going to further weaken FDA standards in the name of speed. And so I think that in closing, I want to say, this to me is part of this educate, organize, take action. I hope that together we're going to be able to push back and hold our government accountable so that we don't individually accept the burden of being our own EPA, FDA. We need experts there, watching the store, watching, doing their job.
All right, good morning, and thanks for being here. I also wasn't exactly sure what we were supposed to do on this panel, and I too am going to do a little bit of headline interpretation and then pick a couple of ones that I have some opinions on, some thoughts. I work a lot on climate change. That's one part of my day job, and you're seeing a lot of headlines about climate change. You're seeing the good ones and the bad ones, and I want to just talk about how to interpret them and how to maybe get behind them a little bit. First of all, you're seeing a lot of headlines on temperature, and that's part of the way that people talk about climate change impacts and targets and so on. Number one, just remember that most of what you're seeing is in Celsius, which is not the way that we as Americans kind of gauge whether it's hot or cold. And so Fahrenheit is always going to be higher than that. What's really important and what makes climate change so insidious is the concentrations of greenhouse gases, namely CO2, in the atmosphere. There's an environmental group that I've talked about a couple of times this week called 350.org. You may have heard of them. And they're not that old. They only started about 7 years ago, but they gave themselves that name because their goal was to keep concentrations below 350 parts per million. We recently went over 400 parts per million, and scientists say that we're going to stay there for a long, long time. So you've really got to sort of get behind the headlines and understand some of that. Now to the good part, and this is on renewable energy. You've probably seen a headline saying that solar or wind production is at an all-time high, and it grew by over 100% last year, and that's great, that's good. But that's the rate of growth, and the percentage contribution to the overall electricity generation portfolio is still really, really low. So don't get complacent in seeing those big rates of growth. There's a lot of work that we have to do, and a lot that we have to do very soon. Let me move from that into jobs. And you see a lot of headlines about jobs. That's another part of the discussion, certainly among policymakers, but also among the general populace. Now, mid-career, I unexpectedly found myself without a job. Not having a job sucks, okay? But we've gotten to a point, I would argue, that jobs have become overweighted as a metric in making decisions. And I'm sorry if that sounds harsh, but we're making decisions based on how many jobs are created, regardless of what the other impacts are, particularly in the environment and clean air and clean water and all of that. And I just think we've got to sort of pull back from that a little bit, and that you need to do that in terms of how you evaluate some of these proposals and how you talk to your policymakers. I mean, if jobs were the literal metric, then I would be kind of happy because the amount of renewable jobs, clean energy jobs, solar, renewable, and others, is up at around 600,000 nationwide total right now. For coal, oil, and gas, it's down around 60,000. Okay, but yet somehow that's not getting used. But even though that would be great for me, I just don't think that the job metric should be the overall one. Next one, political discourse and bipartisanship. And I live and work in Washington and have done so for a long time. I've moved out and come back and done different things or whatever. But you know how rotten it is in terms of bipartisanship and one side of the aisle not talking to the other side of the aisle. Now, when I first got to Washington, and I did not grow up on the Hill, I came in sort of as an outlier, and all of a sudden I had this job in Washington where I had to go up on the Hill and talk to people. And I made a lot of mistakes back then. This would be in the early 90s, because I naively assumed that all Republicans hated all Democrats, and they didn't. In fact, I had to be careful. I mean, I didn't know, Republicans were sleeping with Democrats, and they were friends, and they were going to the same parties, and I made a lot of faux pas, which didn't bode well for me. But one of the reasons that was, there's a few, and I want to list each one. One of the reasons was that members themselves got along better with each other because they spent more time together in Washington. Okay, partly in response to what they think they're expected to do, including by you, the voters, they actually try and get home a little bit more than they ever did. And that leaves less time for the members to get together and talk about things. And that's when a lot of that bipartisanship, now again, I realize I'm talking about a different decade, a different age, and other things, but I'd list that as one of the factors. The other thing is, right now you have both the House and the Senate on razor-thin margins of the majority. You might think the House is a big majority, but it's really not. And in those days that I got started, there was a big majority. And so the minority knew that it had to get along with the majority to get anything done. And I'm not saying that that's good for the majority in terms of misusing that power, but it really, gave a chance to people to work together because there were people who wanted to get things done in the minority, and that was the Republicans in those days. And they all worked together and got things done. With the Gingrich revolution in the early 90s, that flipped around, and it's been razor-thin margins ever since. And everybody wants to be in power, so they're afraid to yield an inch to the other side. Okay, finally, if I'm not out of time.
No, you're good.
A head-spinning president, okay? Most of us who sometimes refer to ourselves as professional readers of tea leaves in Washington flush them down the toilet after the Syria attack, okay? Because what are you gonna do, And since then, we've had turnarounds, 180s on China as a currency manipulator. We've had Janet Yellen and the Fed. We've had NATO. And this is hard for everybody. It's hard for foreign leaders, it's hard for our leaders, and it's hard for you as a voter. I mean, I have no idea what some Trump voters are thinking right now based on some of what he's done. And what we have is a president that's still a work in progress, for himself, within himself. He's 70 years old and he still hasn't quite formed yet. And he seems to be doing it on the job. And so that makes it pretty hard for everybody else, as long as his word is, you know, taken as the word of the highest leader that we're all supposed to kind of work with. So that's a major problem, and I think, you know, who knows what's to come on that one. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm also glad to be here, and I'm glad it's Friday. I've had 8 panels. And for this panel, I decided that rather than rip something from the existing headlines, and I was afraid that I might be sort of down the row here, and not and there wouldn't be any headlines left undiscussed. So I thought I would highlight 2 events in the near future that are going to make headlines, big headlines. And the first one is on April 16th. That's Easter Sunday. That's day after tomorrow. There's going to be a very important nationwide referendum in Turkey, where strongman Tayyip Erdogan is seeking approval to change the political system in Turkey from a parliamentary system which has a weak president, notwithstanding the fact that he's managed to do okay in that job as president. But he wants to change the system to a presidential system with a very strong president that has control over the judiciary and the legislative, and if he wins this, he's going to cement a sultan-like powers, the sultan-like powers that he already has assumed. He assumed incredible powers following the coup in Turkey last July. And if he wins this race, this election, he's going to put Turkey firmly in the camp of Hungary and Russia that have what is known as illiberal democracies. And Erdogan could remain in power until 2029 under this referendum, these changes. Now the polls, interestingly, are very close on this. And I checked last night. Erdogan is slightly ahead, but it's not much. It's certainly within the margin of error. But, of course, there is fear that under the state of emergency rules that are currently in play in Turkey, that this election may not be as free and fair as it would have been otherwise. Anyway, whatever the result of Turkey, Turkey is going to remain pivotal to American interests and to world interests after April 16th. But if he loses, it's going to be a difficult ally with a difficult future. But if he wins, he's going to be able to govern as an elected dictator. Okay, the second future headline that I think is important, will be important, is important already, comes in 2 parts. It's the French election, April 23rd and May 7th. There's a 2-part election. It's an all-important election for Europe. It is not too much to say that this is really an existential moment for the European Union. And that's what I'm sort of interested in Washington, in my job at the European Institute. Now, right-wing Eurosceptic and anti-immigrant Marine Le Pen is leading in the polls in what has been a 3-way race. And she will almost surely be one of the 2 finalists after the April 23rd vote. She has 24% in the most recent polls. And Emmanuel Macron also has 24% in the most recent polls. So it's a real tight race for the first place. But there's a large percentage of undecideds, and the election could be further complicated by the late surge of a far-left candidate, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who has surged in just in the last week. And now if Le Pen wins, or even if she does very well, it's going to indicate the spread to France of this toxic populism that has brought us Brexit in the UK and Donald Trump in the US. Now, Le Pen is virulently anti-EU. She says that if she wins, she will take France immediately out of the euro and will hold a Brexit-like election on whether France should stay in the European Union itself. So this is a very, very important election for Europe and for the world, I think. There could not be a starker choice. It's an existential moment for the EU. And anyway, watch for those headlines.
Joe?
Good morning. Because I'm a sort of dark, morbid Irishman, I'd like to begin my presentation with perhaps a moment of silence. If you could bow your head to remember the headline, for it is now dead. There's been a lot over the last 10 or so years mourned about, the sort of death of the American newspaper. I've taken to being a bit of a wise ass of late because, if we were all honest with ourselves, they weren't all that great back in their heyday either. But I think you could make a great argument that at least the art of the headline was something really special, a craft. I grew up as a young boy in Brooklyn, New York. There were 7 daily newspapers in New York, and the headline was how you did combat day in and day out, how you sold papers, and and the front page headlines were everything. The New York Post gained some notoriety during one of the bloodier passages in New York City's history with a great headline, "Headless Body in Topless Bar."
No one will ever top that one.
That's the best one.
Which seemed to distill a particular murder in a particular locale. But even at the, I spent 25 years at the New York Times, and it's a complicated place and guilty of a lot of the sins it's accused of over there. But it too, even with all of its self-righteousness and self-seriousness, invested a great deal of energy in the writing of headlines and imagination. And there was a particular, and people could rise up within the newspaper on the ability to write a great headline. And there was one particular master of the art of the headline named Kyle Massey, who was not your classic New York Timesman. He came from rural Arkansas, had a thick accent, weighed about 700 pounds, had a huge ponytail, but he was a fucking genius at headlines. And so I was, this thought occurred to me to recall him, and so I was Googling, of course, back to see if I could find a couple of quick headlines. But he wrote a great headline when Yogi Berra died a couple of years ago. So you have to listen closely because the cleverness is subtle. But if you know Yogi, right, he was legendary not only for being one of the greatest catchers in the history of baseball, but for being the great legendary malaprop artists of all time. Anyway, so the New York Times headline for Yogi Berra's death. Yogi Berra, Yankee who built his stardom 90% on skill and half on wit, dies. So today, right, and the art of the headline has disappeared. When we sit down, no matter what quality story, no matter what kind of unique set of facts are contained in those stories, you're mainly tasked with writing a headline that will produce the greatest search results or function best in search on the internet. It's soul crushing. There's great utility to it, and we don't have to sit around and sulk about how we need to sell our news these days. The world is as it is, and we should respond to it. But again, if you might, just bow your head for a second. So I had a couple of somewhat unconventional thoughts as I try to improvise my performance here on a panel that was unclear what it was asking of us. So I thought maybe, how about finding some fucking happy headlines, right? So here's a couple I found. Apparently it's possible there's life on one of Saturn's moons. So whatever your measure of individual despair about the state of America, you got another place you might go. Pack up your sex robot and get there. There's a lovely headline that said, California's wildflower superbloom is so spectacular you can see it from space. So for a state that has staggered through, the better part of a decade of historic drought, the wildflowers are going fucking crazy. Seems worth celebrating or writing a headline about. And then there is there's a Berkeley neuroscientist who's at work on helping us all sleep better. And Christ, don't we need a little of that? Certainly these panelists do after this week. But he had a nice little quote. He said his mission is, I want to reunite humanity with the sleep it is so bereft of. Anyway, seemed like a noble cause and worth a headline. All right, just quickly. So my other unconventional thought was, I do think it's important, one of the challenges of the Trump administration, and I hope this to be a nonpartisan critique, is that I think one of its aims is to produce headlines and what seem like news and reversals and whatever. And the great temptation, and newspapers and news organizations have had a devil of a time trying to respond to it, is, is it worth chasing his latest tweet? What are we to make of this? And if you allow him to dominate the headlines with his tweets, and again, this could be as true of Barack Obama, were he a Twitter fan, so it's not distinctive to his politics. It's just the way it seems to be distinctive to his plans for governing. And, there's great risk in allowing ourselves to be caught up in those daily headlines. If the Korean Peninsula is going to blow up, I think we need to pay attention. I'm paying particular attention because one of my children lives in South Korea. But maybe not, become so enchanted by the idea that he's, declares NATO obsolete one day and not obsolete the other day, or whatever. It's funny, whatever. But when we sat down at ProPublica after the election, we decided, okay, what's the proper response to this rather remarkable turn of events? We thought there was a great obligation to cover the administration in a very aggressive and to point resources at it. But we also made the argument that it would be a mistake and it would be to concede a certain kind of defeat if we walked away from a lot of the other important work that we were doing. And sort of allow ourselves to have the priorities we had set for ourselves as what we thought was important for the American public to know, to be co-opted by a both formidable and fantastical, political creature. So rather than pick specific headlines out of the last week or whatever, I thought it might be worth an exercise to recall some of the headlines that existed earlier this year that I think we would be wise not to forget. So there was a spectacular series of, there's been a lot made about the press's potential failure of having covered Trump during the campaign, whatever. But throughout the year of 2016, there's a young and very talented reporter at the Washington Post named Eli Saslow, who did a remarkable series of stories sort of out in rural America, out in rural impoverished America. And even though it was probably by accident, he probably did as good a job of explaining the Trump election than anybody who followed the latest polls or, researched his, tax history or whatever. He with a great sensitivity and respect and diligence, went out and reported on the people that ultimately went to the polls for Trump. And one of the most powerful pieces he did was on, I'll just read from it, but it's Dateline, Tecumseh, Oklahoma. White women between the age 25 and 55 have been dying at accelerating rates over the past decade, a spike in mortality not seen since the AIDS epidemic in the early 1980s. According to recent studies of death certificates, the trend is worse for women in the center of the United States, worse still in rural areas, and worst of all for those in the lower middle class. Drug and alcohol overdose rates for working-age white women have quadrupled. Suicides are up by as much as 50%. Eli asks, why, after 50 years of unabated progress in life expectancy for every conceivable group of Americans, men, women, young, old, rich, poor, high school dropouts, college graduates, rural, urban, white, black, Hispanic, or Asian, had one demographic group in the last decade experienced a significant increase in premature deaths? Why were so many white women reporting precipitous drops in health, mental health, comfort, and mobility during their working age prime? Why, over the last 8 years alone, had more than 300,000 of those women essentially chosen to poison themselves? Anyway, it was a great body of work. That was just one of the installments, but a very, I think would strike many as a surprising and disturbing phenomenon in America, that it appeared for a headline. It's probably disappeared now. Those people, those women, they're used to disappearing. So I think we would do ourselves right to remember that headline and to remember the story that it told. And then I'll just quickly follow up with one thing. So there was I came to, I don't know if many of you know the work of Rebecca Solnit. I came to it rather recently, but I find her quite remarkable. And she wrote an essay or an adaptation of a book she'd done, and it was called Hope is an Embrace of the Unknown. And I read it shortly after the election, sent it around to my family members and friends. It's good, challenging, bracing, reassuring, scary reading. And I recommend it to you. And I'll just give you a flavor of it. Hope locates itself in the premises that we don't know what will happen, and that in that spaciousness of uncertainty is room to act. When you recognize uncertainty, you recognize that you may be able to influence the outcomes, you alone or you in concert with a few dozen or several million others. Hope is an embrace of the unknown and the unknowable, an alternative to the certainty of both optimists and pessimists. Optimists think it will all be fine without our involvement. Pessimists adopt the opposite position. Both excuse themselves from acting. It is the belief that what we do matters, even though how and when it may matter, who and what it may impact, are not things we can know beforehand. We may not, in fact, know them afterwards either, but they matter all the same. And history is full of people whose influence was most powerful after they were gone. Thank you.
I think one of the things that we've heard a lot about is media confusion. And so I saw this question. I wanted to have the group just think about it and talk about it. It says, how does the average citizen respond to a friend or a loved one who says that his or her news source is the right one, and there's no proof that a mainstream news source such as CNN is any more right than an alternative one such as InfoWars? So, we almost have warring media. How do the average citizens make decisions about it, about what's right and what to listen to? John?
Do you really want to hear more from me?
Sure.
Surely I've worn out my welcome. Look, I'll take a quick crack at it, and it's to play the role of the contrarian. And Al and I were on a TV show or taping this morning, and I said much of the same thing. Again, I like to think, and I hope doesn't come across as laziness, but rather as a sort of thoughtfulness. Go back, find a piece written by Elizabeth Colbert in the New Yorker magazine, probably about 6 weeks ago, whatever. But it was a great sort of review of the scholarship on just how open human beings are to opposing points of view. And you will be, I was anyway, both astonished and sort of brokenhearted to find out just how difficult it is for people to hear anything that doesn't, in one way or the other, vindicate their already formed point of view about their own correctness, their own rightness. So, you know, without getting too, you know, maudlin, it may be that, you know, human beings are wired in a way that, you know, there's no act of journalism, no organization of news that will solve the riddle of, you know, can America find a news source that it widely trusts or whatever. And there has been, and there's nothing new about it, really. Right? One man's InfoWars is another man's New York Times, right? I spent 25 years there, and virtually every day was under assault from people who said you were a liberal news organization, your coverage of the Middle East was anti-Israel, you know, you favor blacks over whites, and on and on and on and on. And the answer is not to, I don't think, to imagine some silver bullet, but to do the very work you know, did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, in 5 years. Do your best to report as accurately, as fairly as you can. Recognize the human imperfection that endeavor is. Cop to your mistakes openly. Stay humble. It's a hard quality for this time, and it's a hard quality for journalists. But we could all use a little humility.
Anybody else want to?
Yeah, I'll just, I mean, my own personal experience and my recommendation to people is, and this is more for, I think, TV media, is, you know, at least one night a week, watch the other guys. I mean, you know, because who knows who's accurate, okay? I mean, you know, back to the original question. I mean, don't assume either one is accurate. And, you know, and also to be able to talk with someone from the other side, and to be able to have a discussion and maybe even a polite argument. But if you're not, once in a while, watching what the other side is watching or reading, then it's difficult to get to that point.
Well, I agree with that. Because I practice it. I'm a big news junkie, and on election nights when Republicans are having a good night, and there have been a lot of those the last few years, I make certain to watch MSNBC. It's just so much fun to watch the meltdown in real time. But what Joe's talking about is what social scientists call confirmation bias. It's not a new thing. But the sort of now the selectivity of the news media, where you pick your outlet that agrees with your views, I don't think that's really new. If you go back to the earliest days of the Republic, newspapers were openly partisan. You know, the Hartford Courant, still in business, I think, was the Federalist Party newspaper. There were Jeffersonian newspapers. I think the Richmond Times-Dispatch was a Jeffersonian, or the Republican, you know, the Jeffersonian Republican Party newspaper. That lingered on into this century. The Chicago Tribune during the McCormick days was known as the Republican newspaper. At least that's where their editorial line slanted, right? And so the idea of, you know, I think we might call it the Walter Cronkite era, the most we trusted anchor person, and when the newspapers were thought to be objective and you could rely upon them. I think that may actually be the anomaly in journalism and political life that goes along with some other anomalies in political life. So I think we're going back to something that has been actually the norm for most of the country's history, and I think you observe it in other countries. The British newspapers are still pretty party. The Daily Telegraph is known as the Daily Torygraph, right? And so I don't, you know, there's a lot to be said about that. I like the idea you ought to take in a lot of news and be serious about it. And you know, I read the left wing press. I read the American Prospect. I read The Nation. I read a lot of liberal publications. I don't see as much reciprocity, which is why I think we always have the advantage.
No comment.
Well, obviously, there's a lot of interest in talking about Trump.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. It appears that he's learning on the job, as Dan said earlier, and the complexities he's facing around the world when he kept saying, this is going to be really easy. This is going to be really easy. What do you think is going to happen now as we move forward? Will the old Trump come back and start tweeting and start spending his time being more of a campaigner than a president, or is he more likely to continue to learn on the job and become a stronger president?
Let me take it. Well, I don't think he's going to become a stronger president. I think he's not going to be president for his full term. And,
That's actually one of the questions too. When's he going to be impeached?
because I think he's going to continue to be crazy. And eventually that's going to take a toll. I mean, he's at 37% popularity now. When he goes down below 20, he's going to become a liability to his own people, his own conservative base. And let's just hope that it happens before, something really bad happens. And this may be, I admit, this may be sort of a Washington sort of based thought. And I may be all wrong about it. And I'm sort of, in a way I would hope that I would be. It would be nice if we would become more presidential and we would have a president that we could actually count on to do at least some of the right things, even if he was from the other party. But I don't think it's going to happen. And I think he's too old to change. And I think he's a sick man. And I think he's going to either get physically sick, or he's going to become so mentally crazy that his own people are going to reject him.
It's a popular position. Go ahead.
So learning requires taking in facts, right? And Trump is just unprecedented for propagating lies. And, not only did the LA Times, when can you imagine one of the top 10 newspapers in the country putting out a 6-part editorial series that begins with a piece, "Our Dishonest President"? Y'all read that? Yeah. They're calling him the conspiracy theorist in chief. Washington Post counted that he has, since taking office, after beginning with, the lies around his inaugural size, big, he has, Washington Post counts 367 false or misleading claims since taking office, right? You gotta deal with the real world and real world facts to learn.
So,
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I guess, when I talked about him being a work in progress, not the core inner man. And, there's been almost clinical discussion as to whether he is a narcissist or not. I mean, we all have our personality types, and that is not going to change, but how he deals with things may change. When we played, parlor games or had beers and talked about the different scenarios here when he came in, I actually had kind of an outlier that I put my money on, and that was that after a few months on the job, he would get bored. And he would just, say, "This is too much work. I mean, take it away, Mike." And that's not going to happen now. He's liking it, and he likes the power, and he likes the visibility and the platform. So, I mean, he could be removed for a number of different reasons. I mean, who knows? There's probably all sorts of stuff still in the closet, but I don't think he's going to step away because he doesn't feel like he can do the job, or he doesn't like it for some other reason.
Yeah, so two thoughts about Trump. One is, I think I'm reminded of two old statements, one from Henry Adams and one from the British ambassador to the America 100 years ago, Spring Rice. Henry Adams said, I think in The Education of Henry Adams, that the progression of presidents from George Washington to Ulysses S. Grant single-handedly disproved the theory of evolution. So you wonder what, and you pair that with Spring Rice. The first time he met Theodore Roosevelt, he's ushered into the Oval Office, and the president is on all fours on the floor with one of his kids. And they're playing horsey, and they're sort of gabbling around, and he keeps the ambassador waiting. And Spring Rice cabled back to London saying, "I've just discovered that the President of the United States is 6 years old." Well, now we've really got a 6-year-old, right? On the other hand, I think this should be taken in. First, he does have these extraordinary instincts. I mean, this is why he galvanized so many people. I didn't see it. I didn't get it. And that is coupled with the tweeting that Joe mentioned. How do we cover a guy who tweets like this? And a lot of people think, is this the right way a president should communicate with anybody, especially the American people? But I think there's a historical parallel here. Set aside the content of the tweets, not to mention their syntax and grammar and spelling. This does remind me a little bit. You may think this is absurd at first, but if you think about it for a while, I think there's something to it. It reminds me of Franklin Roosevelt a little bit. What was his innovation? It was the fireside talks on the radio. That was cutting straight past the media to talk to the American people. And by the way, I teach those to students. I have them read them. They're absolutely masterful. And if you've never read, if you just want to read one, read the first one from the first week in office about the bank holiday and ask yourself, why didn't President Bush give a talk like that in September 2008? Would have helped a lot, I think. So tweeting, so radio, that was the Twitter, not exactly right, but that was the Twitter of the late 1920s, early 1930s. We didn't have TV yet, right? Too long to get in the newspapers. And it had an intimate bond between you and the commander-in-chief for the first time ever that now we try through TV and, to varying degrees, right? And he had an instinct for that, and he was so good at it, right? Now, so yeah, the problem is you jump on every tweet he puts out when they're sort of crazy and all imprecise. That is a big problem. But I think we miss something that I think Trump represents an inflection point in political practice in the age of social media.
I'll say one thing, just because, and I've said it at a couple different panels. It's just important. I get everyone's concern about our current president. But all those concerns, right, need to be informed by context. And I'll just give you one example, because I think we all need to be honest with each other and ourselves. So, for instance, there's much been made about Trump's attacks on the press and fake news and this, that, and the other thing. The truth is, Donald Trump loves the press, and he wants to be loved by the press. There's probably never been a president who loves it more. But if I were to ask you, who is the president who actually most often launched leak investigations based on reporting done by the press, and who more than any other president raised the specter of prosecuting journalists for doing their job? Who would you guess? Barack Obama. Context.
Yeah, actually, there were a number of questions and a number of notes on the app about fake news. There's a great deal of interest in having this group talk about fake news. So if you would, that would be helpful to a large number of people in the audience.
They couldn't hear you.
Oh, I said, I'm sorry. There were a number of questions about fake news, and I know Joe mentioned it, but there's a great deal of interest in this room apparently on talking about, how do we address fake news and what do we do about it. So if the panel would spend a few minutes on that, I think there'd be a number of people in the room that would be very happy.
I mean, my expertise is how positive thinking and raw broccoli will not cure cancer. So I'm going to actually hand it off to the rest of the folks to take on the issue.
I think, back to what Joe talked about initially, he didn't use this term of clickbait, but I mean, it takes a certain amount of discipline that I don't think we've ever needed before. And I sure as hell hope that it's being taught in the schools and the universities and so on, because that's where it all starts, I think. I mean, if you've seen any of the exposés, and there was one on 60 Minutes of one of the top guys, and it's just a commercial enterprise. Yeah. He admits to making up total fake news. Yeah. But he gets the clicks, and the clicks get paid for. And, you know, so it just requires, I mean, we've got so much content out there, whether it's fake news or not, there's a new type of discipline that we've all got to adhere to.
Yeah, I would like to continue this point. I think that the key is to recognize the problem and to recognize and follow the money. Fake news is a business. And it's also the business of state security operations too. And a lot of the fake news that we're talking about here is, you know, the stuff that came out of Russia and other countries who have China uses these alternative these troll platoons and sort of paramilitary information agencies, and we just got to learn where they are and how to shut them down. And I think would be a consensus for this. There's always going to be bad news. There's always going to be mistakes in reporting, but the deliberate distortion for a purpose, either political or for financial, is an easy, relatively easy, target, easier than just the phenomenon of the humans are going to make mistakes. We're not talking about mistakes here. We're talking about deliberate distortions. And so, and I think that, along with there's an education issue here too, of course. Everybody has to be educated how to survive in this internet world and social media world.
Maybe a little international perspective would help a little bit. I've spent my professional career studying China, and Chinese.
You're not saying it right. You're not saying it right. China.
China.
I don't know how Trump says it.
Oh.
Sorry.
And they're used to lies in pretty much every realm of their life. They're taught fake history. Their economic news is often faked. The statistics are faked. It's reached a point where when people read the official mouthpiece of the Communist Party, the People's Daily, they assume that there's something wrong, and the truth is the opposite. And of course, they've developed alternative ways of communicating truth to one another via WeChat, it's their equivalent of WhatsApp, various microblogs, tweets, their equivalent of Twitter. When there've been outbreaks of disease and the government has tried to cover it up, people actually texted the truth of what was happening to each other. And that's sort of the assumption that people have, that the government's not telling us the truth and we need to find it out in some other way. And mind you, this is in an authoritarian regime, one-party state with almost complete control of the print media as well as movies, TV. So if the truth can be revealed there, I'm pretty optimistic that it can be revealed here, right, in a democracy with institutes of higher education that make it a point to try to teach students how to discern truth from falsehood.
So what I think is that fake news is not new. It's been around a long time. We used to have a different word for it. We used to call it propaganda. And so that's always, so in other words, the problem of sorting it out and how to deal with it and all the rest is an old one, not a new one. When this came out, my mind ran back to an old book I want to go back and reread from Daniel. I recommend it to everybody. Daniel Borsten's book from the 1950s called The Image. And it was all about what he called pseudo-events. And what he meant by that, and the examples he gave are mostly media events, not facts and real things like, China launched a missile yesterday, that's an event. A press conference about what might happen or, some invented thing to get publicity even though it may be about something real, that's a created event, a pseudo event, he called it. And so we live in that world. I'm not quite sure what to do about it, but I think what drives it, well, maybe I'll ask this sweeping, seemingly off-the-wall question. Why do we still read Homer 3,000 years after that started as an oral tradition? Because it's a story, it's a narrative. It's something, I'm a big critic of postmodernism. I see one of my new friends, we've been talking about it between student here, we've been talking about it between panels. But they're right about one thing. Human beings are largely creatures of what we now call the narrative. We live by stories. And so an awful lot of what drives this is our stories. The cliche we sometimes use about an inconvenient fact is it doesn't fit the narrative, right? And that's often true. But I think that this would also be a long subject for like weeks, but the idea of scientific objectivity can't eclipse that basic aspect of the human soul that lives primarily by stories and by the narrative. And there we're back to arguing with one another, hopefully in a decent way.
There's a question here, I believe this is from a student. Do you think Facebook or any of the other social media outlets should be responsible for limiting fake news?
I think Facebook is actually taking steps to do that. So they recognize the right. There are two right two versions of fake news. Right. There's the stuff that was whatever generated in Montenegro or someplace, whatever, in which the Clintons killed 59 people and whatever, and it got widely shared on Facebook and other things like that. And there was a great degree of alarm about, did that influence the election or whatever. The most recent reporting I've seen on that is that people think that it had very little effect on the actual vote. The other fake news is just President Trump's claims of it. This is fake news, that's fake news, whatever. Which is really, just another way of any president saying it's news they don't particularly like. And again, I think I'm with Steve on this. Much of this is just not new. But anyway, to return to the question, I do think that Facebook has taken steps. But, ultimately, we're our own police on such matters. As citizens, there comes responsibility, and part of that is to, do the work of yourselves of figuring out what is trustworthy.
Well, the Chinese perspective on this is that people can't be trusted to discern truth from falsehood, and it is the government's role to help them do that. And the government has banned Facebook there, and it has banned Twitter there. And it says, to its people, to its parents in particular, how much pornography do you want, entering into your kids' minds through the internet? And aren't we, the government, taking care of society by limiting information that can do them harm? In other words, the government is playing the role of sort of the father figure, protecting the mental health of the citizens. And you'd be surprised, many people do agree with that perspective. There's a very much weaker libertarian tradition there. There's a much stronger sense that there should be an elite out there, political elite, that knows best for what its citizens want or should want. And it is their role as elites to shape the content of the news that people receive. But very different perspective here.
There's another question. What is the likelihood that the Trump administration's reactions in Syria, Afghanistan, and North Korea are just a way to distract the media and others from the Russian investigation? But I'm going to tackle that one.
Plausible, but I personally don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
Well, but even if it's not deliberate, it certainly is having that effect. And I'm on a panel on Russia in about 20 minutes, and the equation, the U.S.-Russian relationship is totally changed in the last 48 hours. It's no longer about whether Trump aided and abetted the Russians in the election campaign, but it's about whether Trump is going to take out the nukes in North Korea. So I think he's a beneficiary of this changing news cycle, even if he is probably not. He's not smart enough to actually be doing it in a calculated way.
I can't, who knows what's going on inside Trump's mind. But not so many days ago, I was on a panel on the same stage on locker room talk, and Trump arguably has a locker room mind. And as someone else pointed, he's very astute and intuitive about people and how people work. And what's the kind of basic operating principle of the locker room? If you feel under threat, if you're under threat, quick, attack someone else, right? It's a pecking order. And I think, that's where this theory comes from. And I think there's, arguably some truth to it.
Good. I would dispute your theory of locker rooms. Most male locker rooms I've been in, they're just quiet.
Well, the men on the panel.
People don't talk.
That's funny. Locker rooms of a certain age.
Yeah, there were the old locker rooms and today's locker rooms. But I just want to add the ascendancy of the generals on this question with Syria in terms of them having a big part of his ear on this.
Which reassures you or worries you, or?
It's actually a little bit of both. It's all a question of degree. I mean, if that's all he listens to, then that might not be good. But at least those people are kind of regular people.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Which I never thought I'd say that about generals, but
I think I don't know what to make about the Syria business. In the Middle East has been a mess forever, right? The most reassuring appointment Trump made was McMaster to be his national security advisor. I read his book, which is still worth reading, Dereliction of Duty, when it came out 20 years ago. And I thought to myself, this is one time I'm glad Trump doesn't read books. Because if he'd read it, he never would have picked that guy. Because what is the point of that book? As the book was saying back in those early it's one of the best revisionist books about Vietnam ever done. And what he said was, the military leadership, their dereliction was they didn't say to President Johnson, they didn't say to Secretary McNamara, this Vietnam stuff is stupid, it won't work, it's wrong, do not do it. And we didn't do that, we wimped out. And he goes through it in great detail. It gives me some confidence that he might say the same thing to Trump on some other ill-considered idea, including perhaps North Korea, I don't know.
I would just caution us to not buy into this perspective of American omnipotence. I mean, we don't control a lot of the things that happen in the world. I mean, the North Koreans do what they do for their own purposes. Whoever is president, I mean, they've been provocative for successive American presidents. And they're doing the same thing now as they did under George Bush and Obama. Likewise, the Chinese do things that they want to do for their interests without necessarily considering how our president is going to respond. So the world is not always responding to us. It's often the other way around.
And how because there's been some questions on this too, is how do we react now, and how do you see it with your experience with China? How do we react to North Korea's saber rattling and beyond that, actually firing missiles?
Well, I think it's important to recognize the pattern, that this is not a new thing, that their interest is in getting more aid. Their interest is in getting world attention in order to sustain the regime. We have to be very cool-headed about this. Think of Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, at that time, this is a little before I was born, but the crisis evolved over weeks, and they had weeks to decide how to respond properly to the Cuban crisis and the Soviet behavior. Now, everything is much more instantaneous, and politicians often feel pressured, do something. We have to do something. And my concern is that Trump won't bring in the experts that we have on North and South Korea, won't bring in the experts that we have on China and Chinese relations with North Korea, and instead will feel compelled to do something, anything, just as a way of showing, we won't take that anymore. So I'm not sure what the response is, but it needs to be very, very careful and very level-headed in order to not play their game.
Hey, Al.
Yes.
I've got to run, so I thought I'd just say goodbye. And remember, my favorite headline for you to remember, to rip out and, I don't know, wear it on your heart. Hope is an embrace of the unknown. Rebecca Solnit. I'll leave you with a couple lines. Suppose you had the revolution you are talking and dreaming about. Suppose your side had won and you had the kind of society that you wanted. How would you live, you personally, in that society? Start living that way now. It's an argument for tiny and temporary victories and for the possibility of partial victories in the absence or even the impossibility of total victories. Thank you so much for having me.
We are out of time and we're out of questions, so I'm going to thank the panel and ask everyone here to recognize them. And have a wonderful day. Thanks for coming. Where's he?